G'day everyone, it's Regan here from Coral Sea Property Management, your local Townsville property management specialist. And I'm creating this video as a way to explain some of the changes that are coming into effect in specific regard to the changes to legislation that come into effect on the 1st of October this year, 2022, relating to pets and tenants having the ability to keep pets at a rental property. So currently under the legislation, what happens is if a tenant wants to request a pet at their investment property that they're living at, then they put that request in and the owner has the right to approve that request or deny that request, and there's no responsibility for them to give grounds for it. It also means that owners have the option to advertise their property as pet friendly, as pets on application, as we do, or as no pets altogether. And they've got that option to say no as a blanket no to all types of pets at a property. That's going to change from the 1st of October when new legislation comes into effect. And those changes, there's a couple of important things to note about them. So firstly, the changes define what a pet is, and a pet is now defined as a domesticated animal or an animal that's dependent on the person for the provision of food and shelter. Now that's a very broad range definition, and it's also important to note that a pet is not considered a working dog or a working animal. And some examples of that are an assistant dog or a guide dog, a hearing dog, as defined by the Guides, Hearing and Assistant Dog Act of 2009, a corrective services dog as defined by the Corrective Services Act of 2006, or a police dog under the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act of 2000. So it's important to note that although this legislation does define what a pet is, it isn't one of those three things that I've just mentioned before. So what the process now for tenants and what they're going to be able to do is they're able to put a request in writing after the 1st of October to the lessor or the lessor's agent, if you've appointed an agent to look after your property. And that request will explain what the pet is, details about the pet that they're looking to keep. And as a property owner or as a lessor, you've got a responsibility to respond to that request within 14 days. Now, that response is an REIQ form that we're going to be using at Coral Sea as an agency. But that response essentially gives your reasons for whether you accept or approve their request for a pet. If you approve the request, are there any conditions or additional conditions that it's subject to or that are added to it? And finally, if you refuse the request, the grounds for the refusal and why you believe that the grounds for a refusal apply to their specific situation. Now, there are set grounds for approval, and here's where it gets a little bit complicated because you can't just refuse a pet anymore just because you don't want pets at the property. You've got to have a set specific ground to do that. And some of those grounds could include keeping a pet would exceed the reasonable number of pets being kept at the property, that the property is unsuitable for pets due to lack of fencing, open spaces, any other things that are necessary for humanely accommodating a pet at the property. It would likely cause damage to inclusions that could not practically be repaired for a cost less than the amount of the rental bond. It would contravene the law. It would pose an unacceptable risk based on certain circumstances. So there are a list of grounds that you can refuse a pet request. It's important to note that you have to do that within 14 days. So you need to respond to them, or we would need to respond as your agent to that request within 14 days. Now, if you don't respond, what it means is that pet is immediately approved for the property. And that's a big problem because it means that we can't put certain conditions in place that protect you as the landlord. So based on that, one of the rights that you do have now is that you're able to approve the request subject to certain conditions that they've outlined in the legislation. Those conditions can relate to only keeping the pet at the property, being reasonable and having regard to the type of pet and nature, and they can only be stated in writing given to the tenant. So essentially, on approval, we would need to provide those additional conditions that then form part of their lease agreement. Some of the conditions that could be considered reasonable depending on the type of pet that they've got. If the pet is not a type of pet that's ordinarily kept inside, a condition requiring the pet to be kept outside of the property. If the pet is capable of carrying parasites that could infest a property, a condition could be to require the property to be professionally fumigated at the end of a tenancy, which is something that we already do at Coral Sea, but it now forms, I guess, a different framework. And if the pet is allowed inside the property, you can now have a condition requiring the carpets of the property to be professionally cleaned at the end of the tenancy. And that's a really important one. That's one that we've tried to push for tenancies in the past at Coral Sea. Now it is being allowed. You can require them to professionally clean the carpets at the end of their tenancy. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on is some of the tenant responsibilities now if they've got a pet at the property. So the tenant is now responsible for any nuisances caused by the pet, and this doesn't include a working dog, being kept at the property. So, for example, that could be nuisances caused by barking or other nuisances caused by that animal. And you can also now require them, or there's a responsibility for the tenant to repair any damage or inclusions caused by the pet or the animal. Again, not including a working dog. So some of those are if the pet causes damages, it causes scratches, any of those things that you would ordinarily see as pet damage, you can require the tenant to repair that when they return the property at the end of their tenancy. It's important to note, it's a bit of a win for landlords as well, that the legislation now explicitly says that pet damage is not considered fair wear and tear. So there is protections in place there. There are obviously pretty significant changes because previously owners were able to just have a blanket no pets rule. Now you can only say no pets if it meets a certain set criteria. And look, those criteria are relatively limiting. What my advice is as a professional is it's really important to make sure that there's a very thorough ingoing entry condition report with lots of photos so that if your tenant does request to have a pet and there isn't a reasonable ground to refuse that pet request, when the tenant moves out, it's very clear what the property looked like when they received it compared to what the property looks like when they return the property. That makes it really easy for us to compare those two reports and hold tenants to account for the things that they genuinely need to repair when they return that property. It's also really important to make sure that you, either if you're self-managing, are proactively managing the property and you know what's going on every 3 months during your inspections, or if you've got an agent that they're doing the same thing and they're acting in your best interest. During our routine inspections, they can take 15, 20, 25 minutes, usually involve a number of photos, so 20, 30, 40 pages worth of photos. The reason we do that is so that we have a very clear timeline and record of any changes that are occurring at your property. If your agent is just taking 1 or 2 photos per room, this means there's lots of blind spots. And I guarantee you, any damages or where you need to see will be missed in the report if they have not taken adequate enough photos. If you are concerned about this legislation or you wanted to talk in more detail with me about how this specifically affects you, you're always welcome to contact our office and you can speak with me directly. If you're a current landlord with us, you'll have already been sent out a link where you can speak with me and book a meeting with me directly so I can answer any questions that you might have and go through any concerns that you might have before the 1st of October when these changes come into effect. Thank you very much.